Welcome to the Petaluma Gap AVA Accreditation program. My name is Elaine Chacon-Brown. Today we will be discussing the unique growing conditions of the Petaluma Gap that differentiate it from the other 17 AVAs of Sonoma County. A mere hour north of San Francisco, Petaluma Gap is a welcome drive from the city to experience this beautiful region and incredible wines. The Petaluma Gap AVA brings together the southern parts of Sonoma County and the northern parts of Marin County, beginning all the way on the western side at the coast. The northern boundaries reach from Bodega Bay to Sonoma Mountain, and in the south, Petaluma Gap goes all the way to San Pablo Bay at Sears Point. The Sonoma Coast AVA was defined in 1987 to include areas broadly influenced by the cool weather of the Pacific Ocean. Over time, it was realized that the Sonoma Coast AVA includes a wealth of other microclimates. And so more recently, the Petaluma Gap AVA was carved out of this larger Sonoma Coast AVA to define the areas uniquely defined by the windy conditions coming off of the Pacific. The unique growing conditions of the region have caught the attention of top viticulturalists and winemakers, leading to an increase in single vineyard designated wines. Let's hear from their unique perspective.
Yeah, the uniqueness of the Petaluma Gap as an AVA, I think, really is based in a little bit of topography or geography. I know the wind gets talked about a lot. The wind coming in through the gap or gaps in the hills to the west. For me, I think a lot of it is not only the wind coming in and blowing through the area, but then also being able to blow back out to the south towards San Pablo Bay.
We relied upon experts and researchers to help define the unique growing conditions of the Petaluma Gap AVA.
So the way I would describe it is the Petaluma Gap AVA is located within the southern portion of the Sonoma Coast AVA in Sonoma County, but it's also in the northern part of Marin County. And it's actually the first designated AVA to include any part of Marin County.
Today, a little more than 4,000 acres are planted within the Petaluma Gap AVA. Pinot Noir plays a leading role with around 75% of the plantings. Syrah and Chardonnay are both next in line with around 12% each, and a smattering of other varieties take up the rest of the planted acreage in the region.
Once we started talking to people about this area, we realized everybody wanted to understand the Sonoma Coast better. There was an appetite for really knowing what made it unique, and is the Russian River Sonoma Coast? Are you part of Carneros? Are you part of Marin County? And so just by geographically defining it, it made it easier for people to point on a map to see a town. That was very important in the application process. And then from there kind of create a story that took into account the different environmental, weather conditions, soil conditions, and come up with a proposal. The Petaluma Gap is a wind tunnel, and it starts at Bodega Bay, it comes into Petaluma, hits Sonoma Mountain, and then it turns out towards San Pablo Bay.
I am not aware of any other AVAs that have used wind to define their borders. Now, there's lots of AVAs, but in my discussions with the TTB and in our process, there wasn't any other example we could find where wind was the primary factor in helping to determine the borders.
To determine the unique boundaries of the Petaluma Gap AVA, weather stations throughout the regions were used to measure air currents through the area. What was found was that the Petaluma Gap AVA is uniquely dominated by winds flowing from the Pacific Ocean to San Pablo Bay at speeds of 8 miles per hour or more. The Petaluma Gap AVA is in fact the first American viticultural area to be defined by these wind currents. What we have found is that wind speeds of 8 miles an hour or greater actually change the vine physiology. This is because the stomata of the vine leaves begin to close at this speed of air current. extending the natural ripening arc of the grapevine through the season, slowing respiration, and retaining natural acidity. The longer hang time also means deeper natural flavors in the grapes themselves. And over time, we've also found that winds can actually thicken the skins on the grapes. The result is wines of incredibly vibrant acidity, naturally robust tannin, and incredible texture. Because the Petaluma Gap AVA is actually surrounded by two different bodies of water, the Pacific Ocean on the west, San Pablo Bay in the southeast, fog also plays an important role in the growing conditions of this AVA. Evenings and mornings are often full of fog throughout the region, but the natural air currents of the afternoon guarantee any excess moisture is naturally dried by the wind itself. The Petaluma Gap AVA includes a host of multi-generational wine growing families. Now let's hear from some of them.
So it is about 1988, and they start thinking what they would like to grow in this area. They have a road, they're sort of established, and they go to Davis, and they realize they're at a couple of things. We're very close to Carneros. Carneros at that time was probably the closest grape growing region we had. And it becomes interesting, and Davis confirms, yes, you've got climate, it's a good area for grapes, even though there's not a lot of vineyards out here. What they did tell us was that it was very cool, and we had to be very careful what we planted. They suggested to plant Chardonnay, basically because, in their own words, if it didn't ripen, we could always sell it to a sparkling wine producer.
Well, our family's been farming in Sonoma County for 90 years, and the last 50 years been as wine grapes. And the last 30 years is when we ventured over here to Petaluma and the northern portion of the Gap and the southern portion of the Gap, and we've been growing grapes for 30 years here in Petaluma Gap. Our Roberts Road Vineyard is, we planted in 1999, and at that time, this whole discovery before Petaluma Gap became an AVA, and we realized the magnificent wines the whole AVA produces. We found it tucked off in Cotati. At that time, there was no vineyards around there, and so it was known to be too cool to grow wine grapes, and it turned out to be an exceptional wine growing site with the fog from the Pacific Ocean and those wonderful Petaluma Gap breezes that we get in the day to make exceptional Pinot Noir and Chardonnay.
So the formation of the AVA, I think, started as it was a group of growers interested in seeing how we could better understand our region and better communicate it to other people. So we sat down and we set out to do a tasting of wines that were sourced from Petaluma Gap fruit. At the beginning, we thought we'd be able to maybe get 10, 20, some wines that maybe 70% Petaluma Gap fruit. But as we started getting samples in, we realized we had over 80 samples of wines that were 100% Petaluma Gap. But because it was not a recognized AVA, you had to know what vineyards you were sourcing from. And that made it a lot more complicated for people to understand. After tasting the wines and really starting to find those similarities, that acid, the ripeness of the Pinot Noirs, we knew that we had something that made the area unique. And that is when we took a vote as growers. We had a big growers meeting, and we all exposed our ideas. There was a lot of, people were uneasy. They weren't quite sure was it going to be better to be Petaluma Gap than Sonoma Coast? And we voted. And it was very democratic, and creating the Petaluma Gap AVA was voted on. So that's how we started, through a very democratic vote.
The Petaluma Gap AVA includes 200,000 total acres, with a little more than 4,000 vineyard acres planted today.
In the Petaluma Gap, we have around close to 600 acres planted in the Petaluma Gap, and we really appreciate this area, and it is mostly Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, some Syrah, some Viognier, and a few smatterings of some other wines as well, other grapes as well.
So we started planting Chardonnay. That was the first varietal that we planted. Then we added some Pinot Noir. Later in time, we added some Syrah. We were, just as we were exploring what varietals would grow in this area, we kept adding things that were early ripening. And I think Syrah was pushing it. We still think it's a great area for Syrah, but it has its unique, growing conditions. And finally, we do have Pinot Gris.
Winemaking did begin to slowly regain attention through the area, and by the 1970s, both vineyards and winemaking were again being celebrated throughout Sonoma County. Today, more than 4,000 acres are planted in what is now the Petaluma Gap AVA. Petaluma Gap Winegrowers Alliance is the primary marketing organization for the Petaluma Gap AVA, featuring winery, grower, associate business, and wine-loving members from throughout the region. The Petaluma Gap Winegrowers Alliance was founded in 2005 for growers to help each other understand dealing with growing in these uniquely windy conditions. 10 years later, the application to form an AVA for the region would be submitted. The application was submitted based on studies of weather stations through the region for more than 5 years. By 2017, the AVA had been accepted by federal offices of the TTB. And in 2018, the first labels were produced featuring Petaluma Gap AVA on the front of the wine bottle. Today, the majority of wines grown in the Petaluma Gap AVA feature the appellation name on the wine label.
When I first joined the board, there was really no interest in becoming an AVA. It apparently had been discussed at some point before I joined the board, and there was a conclusion that it wasn't anything that they wanted to really embark on. However, as the board got more momentum and became more successful in making the region known and marketing the name with Petaluma Gap and helping educate people where the fruit is grown, where the wines come from, the TTB became aware of this name being used, and some people were putting it on the back label of their bottle saying grown in the Petaluma Gap region. And as the TTB saw and heard more about that, they decided, well, that's a viticulturally significant term, so you can't use it on your label unless you codify it as an AVA. So we were sort of a victim of our own success in marketing the region and marketing the name and helping people become more aware of the Petaluma Gap. And it came to the point where we had taken the marketing as far as we could unless we became an AVA. So the history of the name of the Petaluma Gap actually was one of the things that had to be documented in the AVA petition. And the TTB looks for some existing history. It's a name that has to be relevant to the region. And in this case, since the city of Petaluma is right in the middle, that was kind of a no-brainer. And the term Petaluma Gap had been used for a number of years to describe the physical feature along the coastline where there is a gap in the coastal mountain range. And we were able to document that through research and other media and other sources that the name Petaluma Gap had been used for quite some time to describe that feature. Well, the wind stations, the role of the wind stations in defining the Petaluma Gap were very compelling in that the TTB looks for evidence to support your decision of where the boundary should be. And using that data and the graphs that we were able to provide with that data created a very clear case of how the wind in the Petaluma Gap area was clearly different than winds outside, say in the Santa Rosa Plain or in the town of Sonoma, or Occidental was another one that we had, and the city of Novato. So being able to show those clear differences serve to really cement the decision that we use to define those borders of the AVA.
The effect of wind on the grapevine physiology results in unique conditions in the final grapes as well. We've also found that acidity is slightly increased in the natural grapes as well, also as a result of the wind. The extended hang time of the growing season, we also know, deepens the tone of the resulting flavors and creates wonderful concentration in the wines.
That general cooling trend and that air movement, the marine air kind of always being in the Petaluma Gap really creates, I think more than anything, a longer growing season, which is really effectual to the ultimate wines that are made. There's daily effects with the fog coming in the morning, taking a while to burn off, coming back in the afternoon. There's some moderated overall temperatures that way, but at least in my mind from a vineyard perspective, I think the biggest change is that the length of the growing season that it creates. The impact of wind specifically on the fruit itself can be, I think there's a couple different manifestations in my mind. One of which you hear quite a bit about is the thicker skins, which really creates a different skin to pulp ratio, which does all kinds of things in the wine at that point. It can create smaller berries by effectively stressing that vine a little bit more with wind beating it up all day. It can create, again, that longer growing season. I think people think about and talk about grapevines shutting down, on a daily cycle due to lots and lots of heat. Grapevines have the ability to say, you know what, it's too hot out here, I'm not going to work today. They can effectively do the same thing when it's too windy, when they reach a point of imbalance for their daily cycle. It can basically turn those stomata off and say, we're not making any sugar today either.
The wind that blows at the Petaluma Gap is unique because it's constant. It happens every day, and it creates unique growing conditions for the grapes. So as the wind is blowing in, it's beating on the grapes. So on one side, it is also making it harder for those little berries to grow. It's thickening the skins, and where we get most of the tannins and flavors is in the skin. So we get skins that are thicker than other grapes from other areas. So there's a little bit less juice and thicker skins, which creates wines that have a little bit more depth and more tannin structure, and that you can also pick a little bit earlier because of those kind of ripening conditions. The other thing that the wind does is that the wind actually cools the area, so it allows for the acid to kind of stabilize, and we retain more acid than other areas because we're cooling down every afternoon, and we don't have as many hot days here.
In terms of challenges in the Gap growing grapes, I think a fair way to say it is that everything's a double-edged sword, or every coin has another side. So we talked a little bit about the length of that growing season and how beneficial that is to the ultimate wines produced, and the balance it provides in texture and keeping acidity and everything that does in a positive side. The other side of that coin is a longer growing season, more time for things to potentially happen out there, specifically early rains in the fall, right before harvest, something like that. We talked about the fog and the cool marine air always moving through. That moderates temperatures, creates everything that we said about the ideal conditions for growing grapes in many ways. One step further from that, so a bad year, a bad day, a bad week, it creates something that is too wet, too humid, and creates an environment where there's potential disease issues, or at least disease pressures for grapes that may be elevated that way. So, the challenges, I think, are all the same that they would be growing grapes anywhere. They're potentially highlighted or exaggerated in some ways, but that is only a byproduct of some of the really beneficial parts about the Gap too. So we're walking a fine line all the time.
Yeah, so the Petaluma Gap is definitely a long, slow growing season, along with part of that is because it's one of the first for us, for our vineyards, for bud break. And so with that, it starts the season a little earlier, but it elongates through the whole season. So it's that whole hang time component that every region likes to claim our hang time, but Petaluma Gap is true. And we see a long, slow, spread out season, and that allows the vines and the grapes to stay on the vines that much longer to produce wonderful, amazing flavors.
I think that the cool climate from the Petaluma Gap, it's influenced by the fog, it's influenced by the wind. We get these shorter days, and whereas we have other vineyards in very actually close proximity to Gap's Crown, and it's vastly different. Just the way that the wind and the fog kind of come through the topography. You'll see fog. I mean, I drive down the Cotati grade, and you're in a tunnel of fog, and it's bright and sunny 2 miles away.
So with Pinot Noir, the longer the season, the more development of phenolic maturity. So it's the skins, it's the seeds. And with that, it's the temperate climate of the Petaluma Gap. You get that amazing, phenolic maturity where it's just not sugar, right? It's not the sugar coming into the development phase of the grapes. It's actually the skins, the seeds. And the skins are so important in the Petaluma Gap because the wind allows for that kind of that earthiness and that suppleness that comes through in all the wines. So that whole long growing season, it allows just that amazing phenolic maturity that, Petaluma Gap wines are known for.
The wines of the Petaluma Gap AVA offer a unique opportunity for tasting rooms, restaurants, and retail shops. So now let's hear from sommelier Christopher Sawyer.
And I feel like that these wines here from the Petaluma Gap really do a great job of not only showing that they're part of Sonoma County, but they're in a very special part of Sonoma County that doesn't taste like Russian River. And it doesn't taste like the Sonoma Coast, even though it is part of it. It has its own little trajectory here, and you go into some of the brands like Keller Estate and the Spring Hill Vineyard, which is out there in the way out there, like near the ocean, pretty much, or you go to Terra de Provicio that have won so many awards. I mean, like, it's not just me that's thinking this, but there's also a lot of critics out there, other than myself and sommeliers. They're going, this place is amazing. Like, what is going on here?
Wines of the Petaluma Gap have naturally vibrant acidity. The reds of the area also tend to have elevated tannin and incredible texture. The combination is wines of structure with deeper toned flavors and plenty of natural concentration.
I especially enjoy the wines from Petaluma Gap with their crispness. Clear and crisp is how I would describe them.
I think balance is a word we use a lot, right? We use it in terms of wine, we use it in terms of what happens in the vineyard. I think balance is something that the natural forces of the Gap create, both in fruit and in wine, really well.
So one thing of growing grapes in the Petaluma Gap and even making wine in Petaluma Gap, I would say authenticity. I really think it's about the pureness of our vineyards, our terroir sites, all the way through the commitment and the dedication that our wineries and our winemakers are putting in to making the best wines and showcasing the Petaluma Gap in the best way, in the most consistent way. And I think of all the AVAs, I think Petaluma Gap's messaging is one of the most consistent, if not the most consistent, throughout the whole region.
When presenting wines of the Petaluma Gap, it is helpful to embrace and celebrate these natural characteristics. For consumers, it can be helpful to describe what you are experiencing in the glass as well. The acidity, tannin, and texture of wines of the Petaluma Gap are one of their beautiful advantages and can be emphasized in interactions with consumers. Chardonnays of the Petaluma Gap have naturally vibrant acidity and wonderful flavor concentration. They also tend to have incredible persistence or lots of length. As a cool climate region, Petaluma Gap AVA gives Syrah a wonderfully savory component, elevating the natural tannin and texture in the wines while bringing incredible length through the naturally vibrant acidity. Pinots of the Petaluma Gap AVA have elevated tannin, leading to great longevity in the bottle, while also serving as a wonderful accompaniment to any meal. The tannin also lends itself to incredibly pleasurable texture on the palate, and the elevated acidity makes for lengthy wines. The unique growing conditions of the Petaluma Gap bring all of these elements together in wonderful balance alongside a great complexity of flavor. You can learn more about the region, the organization, its members, or become a member yourself by visiting petalumagap.com. The Petaluma Gap Winegrowers Alliance would like to thank our friends and sponsors who made this program possible. The Petaluma Gap, from wind to wine.